Okay, evening and welcome to another video from the Pit of Doom. So tonight's video is all about the 10 albums that got me into death metal. A thread response from Metal Mickey, and there's been quite a few of these going around so far, and I'm a bit late to the party, but I'm going to attempt to do this one tonight. Death metal as a genre was a pretty easy genre for me to get into. The year would have been around 80, 87, 88 or 89, but most likely 88, because right from the off I'm going to show you the album that got me into death metal properly, and then go through the 10 albums that were the path building up to that. So the album that got me into death metal properly was Death's Leprosy in 1988. This one, obviously, this one is going to be really popular with everybody because they were commercially available as a band back in '88. So I guess a lot of people would have heard of this album even before the internet and such, through magazines, major magazines and the like. So this was the starting point. Now in '88, this was a little bit too much to bear. Originally, a friend of mine from up the road from me had come round my house and seen my cassette collection. I had everything on cassette and vinyl back in '88, and he said, so what are you into? And I said, well, I'm into, all kinds of metal, everything, from Iron Maiden to Dio to the thrash that I was listening to at the time, like Slammer, Zentrix, Sabbath, all UK bands. And he said, have you heard anything from America? I said, well, yeah, I've heard tons of stuff from America, the big four, obviously, Testament, Exodus, Death Angel, all of those type bands. He said, have you ever heard any death metal? I didn't even know what death metal was in '88. So he said that he had this particular album. He just bought this on cassette, and he would bring it round and see what I thought of it. But he was also saying that it was an experimentation for himself to get into death metal. So he bought this blindly, and he had no idea what it was going to sound like, but he quite liked it. Anyway, he brought it round and he played it to me, and I was completely blown away. It was just like nothing I'd ever heard before in my life, and I needed to have a copy of this. So he was really gracious at the time, and he said to me that I could borrow the cassette as long as I wanted. He'd played it to death at that point. I could play it as long as I wanted. In the end, he ended up saying to me that he was trying to get into lighter metal, in the form of he see that I had a cassette by Aerosmith, might have been Permanent Vacation or something like that, or Pump, or whether that was out or not, I can't remember at the time. So we did a trade. He gave me the Death Leprosy on cassette, and I gave him the Aerosmith album, and that was my first foray into death metal. Anyway, back to the point in hand, the 10 albums that got me into death metal. So the build up was quite gradual until this point that my friend up the road had played me this album by Death. So in 1987, one of the first pieces of vinyl that I bought in that year, and I still own, even though I've gotten rid of my record collection way back in the early 90s, was Tankard Chemical Invasion, which, being a German thrash band, one of the big four, this was quite a common album at the time in 1987, and it's super fast and just typical of the thrash at the time, really. And there's so many good tracks on this. It's a 10 out of 10 album for me. Every track is absolutely fantastic, but the song that really did it for me was Puke, which was a very short song, basically about being drunk. So that was that, 1987. Already into quite extreme thrash, as you can tell by that. And then there were other bands, Swiss band Coroner. This band at the time, they were quite the obscure band. I mean, they were doing the rounds on MTV. They'd done a cover of Jimi Hendrix' Purple Haze, which I imagine everybody must have heard at the time. And that was from '88. Then by '89, '89 was a big year for thrash for me. Being as I'd missed out on the very early years of thrash, you know, from sort of 80, 83, 84, 85, just being too young. In '89 I was 16 years old, and this was the album that really captured my ear. In 1989, Kreator. And by the time I bought this in '89, I just went backwards and bought everything else that they'd done as well. They were a fantastic band. So now, later into '89, Morbid Angel became quite a name on the scene, and of course everybody knows All Was a Madness, and everybody bought All Was a Madness. I'd say basically still a thrash album venturing into the death metal realms, as many of these I'm going to show did in 1989. So that's All Was a Madness from 1989. Then again, through a friend who was into more extreme music, excuse me, dry throat, he's into the more extreme end of the thrash spectrum. He showed me the band Atheist, Piece of Time. Now this was really visceral. This was as heavy as I could take in '89, and bearing in mind the Death album Leprosy from 1988 was nowhere near as fast as this album was. So there was a slight difference between the sounds, even though they're classed as death metal basically, but I'd still say visceral thrash metal. And then slowing it down slightly, but still I've put this album in there because everything at the time I was slowing myself down. I was going to be getting into the more doom death sort of stuff later on from this, and this was a pointer, a DRI album, Thrash Zone, nothing to do with death metal obviously, and a crossover band to boot, but that was a turning point in between thrash and death for me. And then the obvious albums came about. Of course, this one, Entombed, Left Hand Path. Not entirely sure how I discovered this one, but I guess there was a lot of talk about it, and it was all over the magazines and everything. As was the band Obituary. Now they'd already had an album out, Slowly We Rot, which had completely passed me by in '89, but Cause of Death, I'd say now we're talking totally into death metal. And then Morrisound was the studio of choice for bands in 1990. So I hadn't liked this band previously because I wasn't particularly into grindcore, but this one changed my mind. Harmony Corruption, again from 1990. And along the lines of death metal that was completely different from anything else that was going on at the time, Nocturnus, The Key. This was just like nothing that had ever come before. It was just so unique. I believe the first death metal band to have keyboards in their sound. So that's the 10 albums that got me into death metal at that point. But like I say, '88, I'd listened to Death's Leprosy, kind of shelved the idea of really being a death metal fan or looking for anything else, and I'd gone through those 10 albums I've just shown as a precursor to getting into the more brutal stuff. And I suppose the more brutal stuff, it would have taken place 1990, 1991. 91 being probably the biggest year for me getting into death metal properly, and mainly through Terrorizer magazine being one of the prominent magazines at the time that used to have a ton of stuff related to death metal, and I think death metal was like ultra popular by 91 anyway, and this particular copy of Terrorizer came with the flexi disc, which had the songs, let's have a look, Eternal by Paradise Lost and Twisted Mass of Burn Decay by Autopsy. Again, like I say, those two albums were out in 1990, so 1991. So by 1991, I'd gone through that stack of albums that I've just shown, getting to that point. So roughly taking sort of 4 to 5 years to get that heavy, that brutal, with those albums in 91. But also in 91, I'm going way over the 10 now, I know this, but also in 1991, Death Doom was starting to become a real big thing for me. So I'd got into Cathedral and Boltthrower, and of course Cannibal Corpse. Just staples of the genre, really. Stuff which was a little bit less commercial, for us living in the UK at least. The band Unleashed, who had a song all over the Headbangers Ball at the time, which was what was it? Where No Life Dwells, Before the Creation of Time, perhaps that was the song. Yeah, that was the song that got me into that. And then a really unique one-off album by a band from America, Ripping Corpse, all 1991, and Dismember Like an Ever-Flowing Stream. But one big mention to the year 91, I think it was. So 1991 was the year getting into pretty much everything. But 1990, this compilation album came out at Death's Door. So between the first 10 albums that got me into death metal that I've just shown, this album had this on cassette as well, and everything on this was just fantastic. And I went about getting every single album off of this album. So bar two, I think there's 12 songs on the album, and I bought 10 at the time, bearing in mind these would have all been on cassette or vinyl at the time, but it's taken sort of it took me many years to recoup them on CD. So the first track on that compilation was Sepultura, Mass Hypnosis, and the second song was, this is printed so small, but Pestilence. Okay, I'm not going to read the song titles out, that is far too small for me to tell. The third song would have been by Deicide. These years are all over the place, between sort of 88, 87 and 91. Morgoth is on there as well. Exorder is also on there, and of course the Obituary song from the first album is on there, and Malevolent Creation, a band called Believer, Christian metal, more of a thrash band than a death metal band for that, because I guess around about the time that the album was compiled, there was variations in the scene of death metal, so they did have a few bands on there that were more more fresh than death metal. The likes of Cerebral Fix from the UK, who had the song, what was it? Cult des Morts, from their debut, Tower of Spite. That was on there. And there was 2 bands on there that I ended up not getting because they're not really anything that I was interested. I wasn't interested in Atrocity, and I wasn't interested at the time in Sadus, although I do like the band Sadus, but I don't have that album. So yeah, in a roundabout way, that's the 10 albums, and many more that got me into death metal. So there you go. Hope you enjoyed that.